guys, how lovely to have you again for our bedtime story tonight. I hope you've had a wonderful week. We have been, well, chasing butterflies, you might say, because we've been growing butterflies at our preschool, and this week they got to fly. And that made us think about all the little places in our garden that little creatures might want to live, which in turn reminded me of one of my absolute favourite stories. So are you ready? Snuggle yourself in tight. Have you got your favourite cuddly? Great, then let's go. Tonight we're reading The Fairy Garden, written by Georgia Buckthorne and illustrated by Isabella Mazzanti. Mimi was a perfectly ordinary girl who lived in a perfectly ordinary life. She had toys to play with, a little brother who wasn't too annoying, and cakes on her birthdays. Mimi didn't want many things, but there was one thing she wanted so very much indeed. To see a fairy in her garden. Mimi knew that fairies are good, kind and wise. She was sure they would only want to live in the very best garden. So every morning she worked hard to make her garden perfect. Anything less than perfect had to go. Every weed was pulled, caterpillars leaving lacy holes, and leaves were picked off and flicked away. Plants were sprayed to keep the bugs at bay. And every night Mimi watched and waited at the window. But each night she'd grow sleepier as the hours passed, until she awoke in the morning, having seen precisely no fairies at all. Mimi worked even harder. The flowers were staked, the leaves were raked, the tree was trimmed, the hedges were clipped, the grass was snipped, and she spritzed a few puffs of bug spray onto the blooms for good measure. And all around the garden she placed little fairy houses, so the fairies would have a place to call home. There would be no garden more perfect in the whole wide world, she thought. But still, the fairies didn't come. Didn't they like her fairy houses? Was the garden just not pretty enough? She was trying so hard to make the garden perfect. Was she doing something wrong? Oh. One morning, Mimi looked around. There was no mess left, no nibbled leaves or fallen petals, and not a caterpillar to be seen. There was nothing left to try, except some final touches. A little fairy footpath of shiny stones, and a daintily painted welcome sign to make them feel at home. Later, as the moonlight cast shadows over the usual empty garden, Mimi couldn't help crying a single tear. But then, all of a sudden, a group of twinkling lights appeared. Oh, it was the fairies. They came closer and closer, fluttering and glowing in silvery balls of light. Mimi had been right. The fairies were good and kind, and they couldn't bear to see her upset. "Mimi," said the first fairy, "don't cry. Thank you for the beautiful houses and footpaths and welcome sign you have made for us." You're welcome," Mimi replied. "I wanted to make the garden perfect for you, so that you would want to live here." The first fairy smiled sadly. "Mimi, we were here all along, but when you raked up all the leaves, you raked away our cosy nests. And when you pulled the weeds and used the bug spray, it made our pet caterpillars sick. Your garden is perfect for people, but not for fairies.
If you want us to return, we need our wild fairy garden back. Mimi thought back to the caterpillars that she had flicked away and the leaves she had raked, and she felt awful. "I am so sorry," she cried. "That's okay, Mimi," said the first fairy. "We know you meant well. Not many people know what makes a real fairy garden, but now you do. Will you help us?" After that, Mimi looked after her garden very differently. She still got up every morning to check that it was perfect, but now perfect looked something entirely different. Sometimes Mimi saw the fairies, and sometimes she didn't. But she always knew that they were there in her fairy garden. And if you would like some tips on how to create your own fairy-friendly garden, make sure you have lots of wildflowers. Maybe make wildflower bombs to put around places. Don't use chemicals, because fairies are shy. They need plenty of long grass to hide in, and maybe somewhere to swim. Perhaps a little wildlife pond. And you can even create them houses out of plant pods. But whatever you do, remember that perfect is different for fairies than for people.
So, what did you think of Mimi's beautiful fairy garden? Are you going to change your gardens? And do you know, if you don't have a garden, you can make a window box just the same. Fairies aren't fussy, as long as you make sure that nature exists. Maybe even a little pond. But now it's time for you to go to bed. So snuggle in tight, close your eyes, think of the happiest thing you can, maybe your very own fairy garden, and then have magical dreams. And tomorrow is going to be another wonderful day. See you next time.